Have you ever moved someone up in leadership only to discover they really couldn't handle the responsibility? Then you find yourself asking the question, what did I do wrong? Well, in today's video, I'm going to share 5 critical transition factors you must consider before moving someone to the next level of leadership. Hey guys, this is Mac Lake bringing you tips, tools, techniques, helping you develop more and better leaders. You know, it can be so discouraging moving someone up to a new level of leadership in your leadership pipeline, only to discover they really can't handle the responsibility. Years ago, I took a great young guy in our church. He was a faithful leader in our student ministry, and I moved him up to a student pastor in our church. Now, he had a great personality. He was passionate. People loved him, and that was pretty much the only criteria I used to decide that he was the right guy. Well, over the next 2 years, I watched him struggle again and again and again to successfully lead that ministry department. And I provided coaching, I provided classes, I provided anything I could to think of ways I could enhance his development. But ultimately, we had to remove him from the position because he didn't have the ability to lead at that level. Well, a few years later, I read the book Leadership Pipeline, and that's when it struck me that this guy's failure was more my fault than his fault. He was good at leading others, and because of his faithfulness and his personality, I moved him up to become a leader of a department. Now, if you're familiar with the leadership pipeline, you'll recognize that when I moved him, I skipped levels. So by moving him from leading others to all the way up the pipeline to leading a department, I undermined his developmental process. Now, one of the things I absolutely love about the leadership pipeline concept is it shows us that there are necessary developmental factors at every turn in the pipeline. And ignoring those developmental factors, or what I call critical transition factors, can cause us to undermine a person's developmental process. Now, in a previous video, I described the leadership pipeline in depth, so I'm not going to go in depth here with it, but we will include a description below so you can go back and watch that if you're unfamiliar with the concept. Now, Walt Mailer is the founder of the leadership pipeline concept, and he says every organization needs a leadership pipeline. He describes it as a way to structure your organization that creates a clear developmental pathway for others to grow in their leadership. Now, the bottom of the leadership pipeline is the largest pool of people. It begins with leading self. And some of those people flow up to the next level, which is leading others. Some of those flow to the next level, which is leading leaders. Some of those flow to the next level, which is leading departments. And ultimately, some will flow up to the top of the leadership pipeline, which is leading the organization. But moving someone from one level to the next requires some analysis and assessment. And the key to success at leading at one level is different than leading at the next level. And skipping levels can undermine their growth. So for this reason, I recommend you consider the following 5 critical transition factors when choosing to move someone from one level to the next. And I'm going to give you the critical transition factor and then a question with each one, okay? So critical transition factor number 1 is calling. The question we can ask here is, do they have the calling to move from one level to the next level of leadership? Just because you have a need and they appear to have the competencies doesn't mean that God is calling them to lead at that next level of leadership in their life. Calling is something that has to be factored in to the movement of someone from one level to the next. There have been times, and you've probably experienced this too, when I've recruited someone and I've gone to them and I've said, hey, I've been praying about you, and I've been praying about this opportunity we have in leadership role. And then I ask them to pray about it, and I'm surprised how many times they look at me and say, you know what? God's been prompting me to do something more. I can't believe you're asking me this. Well, when that happens, that's a clear indication that they may have a calling from God to move from one level to the next. Now, not everybody has that calling. A few years ago, my wife, who has served in 2 different churches as a coach, a small group coach, which is the leading leaders level, she was asked a few years ago to consider becoming the women's small group director. Now, I can say with full confidence that she has the ability to do that role, but she easily said no because she knew that was not God's calling on her life. So as we move someone from one level to the next level, we have to factor in the consideration, is God calling them to move to that next level? The second critical transition factor is competency. And the question you want to use here is this: do they have the potential to develop the competencies required for that level? Now, please understand, we're not saying that they have to be able to demonstrate those competencies right now. But there is an indication that they're leading well at their current level. They've become proficient in the competencies of that existing level, and they're growing towards the competencies of the next level. Now, obviously, to answer this question, I'd recommend two things. Number one, make sure you have identified at least 5 essential competencies you expect for someone in that leadership role at that level. And then secondly, share those competencies with them and have a discussion with them assessing their current level of ability in each of those 5. Now, what this is going to do, it's going to show you the aspects of where they need to grow, where they're already strong, and it's going to give you a better idea of how you can develop them to lead well in that new role. The third critical transition factor is commitment. Here we need to ask the question, do they understand the level of commitment required at the new level of leadership? So for example, take someone who is a small group member. They have a different time commitment than someone who is a small group leader. A small group coach has a different time commitment than a small group leader, and a small group director has a different time commitment than a small group coach. It just makes sense. So the commitment level is different at each level of leadership. So when you're recruiting someone to that next level of leadership, make sure you provide a written job description that clearly identifies the expectations for that person. This means spelling out both the time commitment as well as clearly stated expectations for what they're going to be doing in that role. And you want to sit down with them in advance, explain this to them so they understand the level of commitment that you're asking from them. The fourth critical transition factor is core values. The question here is, do they understand and embrace our core values? Now, obviously, you're going to have different level of expectations around values for someone who's leading a team versus someone who's leading the organization, all right? So I look at it this way. For someone that I'm pulling into leadership, where they're going to lead others, I want them to understand our core values. For someone who's leading leaders, I want them to embrace our core values. Then for that next level of leadership, that leading of a department, I want them to embody our core values. And then for those who are leading the organization, they should be able to equip others in our core values. The further someone goes up in your pipeline, the more they should embrace and embody the core values of your organization. And finally, the fifth critical transition factor is character. Here we have to ask, do they have the character that can withstand greater levels of temptations of pride, power, and prestige? You see, we have to understand, the further someone goes up the leadership pipeline, the more they're going to have to embrace servant leadership and demonstrate high levels of integrity, because the higher you go in the pipeline, I promise you, the more subtle and the more powerful the temptation is to pride, power, and prestige. And so as someone grows in their leadership, there's just greater temptations of pride. They can look at the title and the role, and they can become prideful about what they've accomplished rather than what God's doing in their life. Or they can experience the temptation of power. Instead of being a listener and listening to God and listening to others they're serving, they can begin to force their own agenda, their own way, their own vision, and they can begin to abuse the power of that role. And then there's the temptation of prestige. I've seen this so many times. All of a sudden, they're in this new leadership role. They expect others to treat them differently, and they might feel privileged because of their role. And all of a sudden, they're expecting people to honor them in a different way without giving honor to others. Guys, we have to remember as leaders what Jesus said and model ourselves after him. He said, "I have not come to be served, but I've come to serve and give my life a ransom for many." So as you look at your own leadership pipeline, you probably see some deficiencies. You see some areas where you need some more leaders, but please be careful of just grabbing the closest, most willing, warm body and throwing them in the role without asking these 5 questions that are going to help you process the 5 critical transition factors. This becomes a checklist. It helps you know when you can begin to mobilize someone to that next level of leadership. It's not that they have to be perfectly ready for the position, but they must be willing and show evidence that there's a calling, that there's potential to develop the competencies, there's an understanding of the commitment, they're embracing your core values, and they have a character that is growing in the likeness of Christ. And so for more on the leadership pipeline, click right here, and I will see you in next week's video.